See you all. Yeah, everyone seems to have self-selected and gone to this side, so I'll do that as well. And thanks very much for joining us. It's good that we've got friends from a couple of other local churches. I think we've got some St. Francis and New Addington Baptist. So thanks for joining us as well. You could be some leaven for the lump tonight. Yeah, it's really good to see you. And before we do anything else, let's pray. Gracious God, we come before you this evening and we ask that you would just be near to us, that you would help us to listen well, listen thoughtfully. We are talking about issues which are complicated and difficult. We acknowledge that, and we just pray that you give us grace and you give us wisdom, and you would help us to, in one way or another, just come away perhaps more thoughtful, more informed, and with resolve or some kind of greater capacity to respond to these issues as they arise around us. And we ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Well, it's good to see you all. I just thought I'd say a couple of things, first of all, by way of introduction and a little bit about the format this evening. We've been running these Sunday night theology evenings sort of off and on, I think for the last couple of years in SBC. We took a break last year and moved them to Thursday, which was a partial success. But so that's why we're back on Sunday. But I think one of the things we just want to do in these evenings is stretch ourselves and go a little bit deeper. And in the past, we've looked at topics like AI, we've looked at death and dying. We spoke a bit about assisted dying when that topic was in the news. And yeah, we want to stretch ourselves. So when we come to this evening, perhaps a health warning is worthwhile. You know, some of the ideas that we are going to be talking about are difficult. They are ideas I struggle with and find offensive, but we still need to face up to these things. We can't ignore them. But we can help each other by being thoughtful and measured in the things that we say and how we express them. Maybe just one final qualifier, which I think is important. The focus of this evening is on right-wing politics and on ways in which some people on the right are using Christian ideas and symbols as part of the appeal that they're making. And some of us might be thinking, well, there is an issue with the far left in Britain as well. I wouldn't want to deny that, but I want to focus on the far right because I think it's fair to say that it's those groups who have a tendency to appropriate Christian theology and Christian narratives. I don't see far left politicians doing that. In terms of preparation for this evening, I've read one recent book. I've done a lot of reading online. And I've drawn a lot on the work of Helen Painter, who is a British Baptist minister and lecturer at Bristol Baptist College. I was a student with Helen. Actually, we both did our ministerial training together. And after a couple of years and doing a doctorate, she's gone back to the college. And she heads up a Centre for the Study of the Bible and Violence at Bristol Baptist College, who are doing really important work about all kinds of ways in which the Bible can be unhelpfully interpreted. So what I thought we would do this evening is spend a bit of time in the first half looking at some definitions and some background and how we actually define the far right and how we define Christian nationalism, what it is that we're talking about. And then we're going to watch a video from a recent event, which I'm sure will get us all thinking. We'll talk about our reactions to that and have a little bit of discussion time. And then I'll share a little bit more input about my sort of starters for 10 in terms of how we might respond to this. And we'll aim to be done by 8 o'clock at the latest. It's good for us to sort of know what we're working towards. So where to begin? Maybe it'd be good to start with some definitions. For most of us here, my guess is that all of our lives, most of our lives, will have been lived in a context where the political spectrum was fairly fixed, where we have been used to socialism on the left and conservatism on the right. And of course, that would have been worked out in British politics in the context of 2 main parties. I don't know if we've got the slides, or if they're working. Sorry, thanks, Maggie. Is there a next slide? There was a whole presentation which clearly hasn't been sent to you. Okay. Can we take 5 minutes and we'll talk about that and I'll get the slides. Sorry, okay. It's been a bit of an issue. 5 minutes. I hope that you feel you've used this time well. It was a gift. There we go. Okay. So to recap, we've probably all been used to an experience whereby over most of our lifetimes we've been used to a sort of political spectrum where there was socialism on the left and conservatism on the right within British politics. And that would have been worked out through the Labour Party on the left and the Tories on the right. And of course, at certain times, each of these parties might have moved further to one end of the spectrum or to the centre. So Thatcherism in the 1980s probably saw the Conservative Party move further to the right in terms of economic policy. New Labour would have moved further to the centre to make their pitch to the country in 97. I realise that lots of these assertions can be contested or might need qualifiers, but I think that's a sort of a basic broad brush we can agree on. We might also have been aware that there were further extremes on the spectrum, that there was communism on the left, that there was fascism on the right, but these politics were largely on the fringe in Britain. On the left, there would have been a Communist Party, there was a Socialist Workers' Party. On the right, there would have been the likes of the BNP. But these groups never really came close to making a major impression on our politics. But in recent years, all of this has changed. And I just thought I'd take a little bit of time to sort of go through the background to why I think we might have got to where we've got to. Now, if some of us were here on the Culture Wars evening, a couple of years ago that we did, we covered a little bit of this as well. But I'm just going to try and go through the same ground quickly, because I think we've seen a number of major shocks in British society in recent years, and they've all been disruptors to the political consensus. So first of all, the banking crash of 2008, which we might recall. And I remember at the time of the crash, listening to a commentator say, when there is an economic shock, it usually takes 10 years for the political shock to occur. You could say that in this case it was 8 years for the political shock to occur, because we then had Brexit in 2016. And as we all know, Brexit highlighted huge divisions within British society and kind of deepened them in a way that I still don't think has gone away. And there seem to have been a number of reasons which led to that Brexit vote. There was a reaction to the status quo, and certain elements of that status quo, globalization, the loss of jobs, including manufacturing and heavy industry. I think even then in Brexit there was a kind of, you can go back to how things were, and you can go back to things when they were better. There was a reaction to austerity and its impact on many communities. there was an anger about rising levels of immigration, which I think people coming from Eastern Europe at that time, there had been rising levels. It was around 2005, I think, when the former communist countries came into the EU. And then, of course, the next shock that took place a few months after that was the election of President Trump for the first time in 2016, which seemed to be an indication that whatever change Brexit was speaking of wasn't just happening in the UK. And, of course, in the way that Brexit seemed to hark back to some kind of nostalgia. I can still remember people saying, I voted for Brexit because I remember when Britain was great. I wanted to be great again. President Trump, of course, spoke about making America great again. So there seemed to be this desire that we return to a time that was perceived as more prosperous or more ordered or more predictable. And then, of course, we had COVID in 2020 as well, which was another huge shock. And it still feels as if recent history is divided into sort of pre-COVID and post-COVID in our memories. And it was a shock socially, it was a shock economically. And where has this left us? It's left us, I think it's fair to say, with this kind of fracturing now in our politics. So we now have your party, I think that's what it's called, I'm not quite sure, Jeremy Corbyn's new vehicle, and the Greens on the left, Labour and Lib Dems, and then through to the Conservatives and Reform. We could argue about where exactly they are on this spectrum, but you can only fit so many gaps into one PowerPoint slide. The other thing which I think is relevant in all of this in terms of background is that there seems to be a much greater emphasis on identity within our politics. And that's around a whole series of issues, and I'll go through these quite quickly. Sexuality and trans rights, for example, and we've seen in the last year a little bit of a pushback, both in terms of legislation and then organisations responding to court rulings about definitions around gender. I think there's been an increasing debate around gender roles. If you look at younger people in particular, and this will come up a bit later as well, you will see a very stark divide between the views of young men and young women on feminism. And there seems to be a growing number of younger men who believe feminism has gone too far. And that will have very extreme expressions of that, and the incel movement that some of us may have heard about. But quite a sharp divide between younger men and younger women, and there's some interesting research from King's College that you can Google, which goes into detail on this. There seems to be a greater focus on issues of ethnicity as well, and theories to go with that. So things like critical race theory are now sort of being introduced into our political lexicon. And then there are just a few other issues which I think are just worth briefly highlighting, because they all contribute, I think, to the background and how we got to where we are. There is an ongoing debate about multiculturalism and immigration, but it seems as if in recent years the tone of that debate on multiculturalism has changed, and that it has gone in a way that I find very troubling, from a debate around economics and housing and schools and infrastructure and how many people do we need to do jobs and so forth, to one that seems to focus more on culture and identity. So that, to put it crudely, concerns on migration seem to be expressed more in terms of how many other people do we want to allow in. And if we keep letting other people in, what kind of cultural erosion or cultural loss might there be, or cultural dilution? I hope that makes sense. We might recognize that. Free speech also seems to be an issue which is coming up more and more. Some of us might remember, gosh, it seems longer than a year ago, so much has happened. A year ago since J.D. Vance, the American Vice President, went to the Munich Security Conference, And he spoke in terms of European civilization being under threat. Very stark language. And one of the things that he cited was the allegation that people in the UK are no longer allowed to pray in public. And he was referring to exclusion zones, which there are around some abortion clinics in the UK. I think it's important to be clear. There is no law in the UK that says people can't pray in public, but there are laws around exclusion zones near some of these clinics. Then there's another issue which seems to be coming to the fore of who can be trusted, which again seems to me to be one of the biggest changes we've seen over the last 15 years. This idea of post-truth, which has emerged, or post-facts culture, or alternative facts. I mean, the fact that we even go around using this term, alternative facts, as if it's just a natural thing to say, when it is just so troubling and weird, and clearly playing fast and loose with rationale is I think, quite disturbing. And the idea now, I think, that every news story is questioned, or where some figures seem to lie or boast with a sort of shamelessness is disturbing. Remember last year watching the 70th anniversary of Auschwitz being liberated? We might remember that story, and thinking, that was shocking, but actually the world quite quickly caught up with a settled view of the facts, acceptance of the facts about what happened during the Holocaust. I wonder if there was a similar event these days, whether we would agree, or would there just be another whole world out there where people were saying it hadn't happened. It's a very disturbing, when you can't agree on what's actually happened, it's very troubling. And that takes me on to two more things. Conspiracy theories. So some of us may have heard terms now like the Great Replacement. There are people like QAnon. I'm not going to go into what these are. I mean, COVID vaccines. So much speculation about COVID vaccines and what was going on, which I know a number of people, for whom that was their kind of entry point into an alternative world of other theories. And then the last thing I was going to mention was just everyone's angry. There is so much anger. And if you take a look at the level of anger in our politics now, it's just very disturbing. I've had a couple of conversations with people about this recently. I found myself thinking, what is going on with the fact that there's so much anger towards Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, for example. I hear lots of people talk about them in absolutely vitriolic terms. And we may or may not think that our government is underperforming a bit and could be doing some things better. But, Keir Starmer is now less popular than Liz Truss was, when you consider the disaster that was, and just seems to provoke so much rage in people. And of course, when you put all of this together, you end up with a really febrile atmosphere where lots of issues are conflated all the time. So an issue like climate change becomes one which isn't just about the urgency with which we might need to change our lifestyle with regards to scientific evidence about the planet warming up. People will question the evidence. They question whether the planet really is warming up. And then they will say, well, it's a civil liberties issue if you're telling me that I might need to change my lifestyle. How dare you impose any change on me? Because I should be free to make certain choices about what I drive and how I heat my house and so on. And my liberties are being taken away from me if you want to have different policies. To see what I mean? It's just one example of how lots of stuff gets connected. Now, before we get further into the topic, I thought it might be helpful to explore a couple of definitions. And I'm going to talk about what exactly we mean when we refer to the far right and what we mean when we refer to Christian nationalism. So in terms of the far right, I'm going to use a helpful explanation I came across from a guy called Kaz Mudde, who is a Dutch political scientist and has become one of the sort of accepted authorities on this subject. And he says that right-wing movements can be divided into the mainstream right and the far right. So those in the mainstream would be traditional parties such as the Conservatives in Great Britain, who will hold views that are, say, pro-market, pro-small state, perhaps more traditional in terms of social attitudes, but who also seek to gain power through democratic means and who respect accepted norms with regard to the exercise of power. And then he goes on to define the far right as those on the right who are anti-system, which he defines as being hostile to liberal democracy. And then he divides the far right into two further subgroups. He says you've got the extreme right, who in essence who reject the essence of democracy, as he puts it. In other words, popular sovereignty and minority rule. So he would say Hitler and Mussolini and fascists fit into that space. And then he says, in contrast, the radical right accepts the essence of democracy, but opposes fundamental elements of liberal democracy, most notably minority rights, the rule of law, and the separation of powers. It seems to be pretty clear. You could put the Trump administration now in America into that space, certainly of the radical right, in terms of what they're doing, and maybe even moving further right. And some of the language we're beginning to hear here about minority rights as well would seem to me to be in that space. And then what about Christian nationalism? How would we define that? Well, I want to begin with a definition which has been offered by an advocate of this idea, and that is a guy called Stephen Wolfe, who is an American academic and wrote a book that was published 2 or 3 years ago called The Case for Christian Nationalism. And early in the book, he defines Christian nationalism as a totality of national action consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation, as a Christian nation, in order to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good in Christ. Now, I need to stress, I haven't read the book. I have read excerpts, I've read discussion documents on it, I've read online reviews of it. And interestingly, I've read reviews by some very conservative commentators, conservative American commentators who have panned it. They've been very critical. But I think you could summarize Wolfe as arguing for a couple of things which we might recognize. So he argues, firstly, for a return to more muscular and self-confident Christianity. So we're not going to be afraid to assert ourselves in the face of social change that might be characterized as wokeness or progressiveness. He goes on to say that nationalism, pro-Christian nationalism, necessarily involves, in his word, being for one's own people group. So he very deliberately rejects the idea of multiculturalism, and he argues that homogeneity, or a sort of consistency of culture, is necessary for societies to be ordered. I mean, he basically says multiculturalism can't work, and he says that even if there hadn't been a fall, humans would always have formed separate, culturally distinct communities. And then thirdly, he goes on to call for what he describes as measured theocratic Caesarism. In other words, a form of government which ensures Christian values are legislated for and are required of people. So there's a recognition he makes that in their hearts, people cannot be made to become Christians, but the argument is that outward displays of false religion should be clamped down on. So this is where we get into territories like banning hijabs, for example, because that is an outward expression of Islam. Now, it needs to be said, these are not new ideas. They've been around in various different forms for a long time. And I think there are close parallels between that worldview and what is sometimes referred to as civil religion. So there is a history at different times in different contexts and places where patriotism and Christian faith have been put together. So I've come up with a definition of civil religion, which goes like this: that it's to attribute a sacral or religious quality to secular power, such that the state and its rulers are seen as set apart by God and worthy of devotion and allegiance of heart, mind, and body. And if you look at the United States, for example, it seems to operate on many of these principles for a lot of its history. It speaks of itself as having founding principles. It describes itself as a city on a hill. That's a very Christian image. The president traditionally finishes addresses by saying, "God bless America." And part of that mindset is the idea that Western culture has about it a form of exceptionalism that sets it apart and is rooted in Christian heritage. And now that Christian heritage is under threat, is what these people are arguing. And Donald Trump's government has been very clear about this. Some of us might remember a story in the news in November when the United States published a new national security strategy. And it's quite disturbing. You can go online. It's all online. And America has come out and said that the larger issues facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty and sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech, and suppression of political opposition, cratering birth rates, and the loss of national identities and self-confidence. So that idea is coming out of the US, but again, it comes into the UK, again, when we have people sort of saying, well, are we sure about immigration, and what about our culture being diluted? And the US goes on to say, we want Europe to remain European, to regain its civilizational self-confidence, and abandon its failed focus on regulatory suffocation. So what's being meant by civilizational self-confidence? It seems to me there's a return to something traditionally Christian and white. And then interestingly, of course, there was that famous line about one aspect of America's policy going forward, that they would want to cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. So in other words, people who are promoting policies like that advocate a return to this sort of traditional Christian worldview that the US will be supporting. And I don't know if anybody saw a couple of months ago the Charlie Kirk Memorial Service, any clips of that was held after he was shot. It was a blend of a kind of political rally and mega church worship service. It's very odd. It was very troubling. So this stuff is out there and gathering pace. And that brings me to the emergence of Christian nationalism on the far right in the UK. There have been a couple of events over recent months in London which have brought this to greater public awareness. And that includes the Unite the Kingdom rally that took place in September, and the Per Christ Back into Christmas Carol service that was held in central London in December. And a key leader for both these events was Tommy Robinson, who many of us may have heard of. So since the mid-2000s, Robinson has been a prominent figure on the far right in the UK. He was a member of the British National Party, and then the leader of the English Defence League, I think about 2008 to 2012. He also describes himself as a journalist, or he presents as a journalist. His X profile now describes him as a journalist, and directs you to his website, which is called Urban Scoop. So he presents a lot of his work as kind of, I'm telling the truth about what is going on in the UK. And he's been imprisoned 5 times, Tommy Robinson, for a number of offences. And the last time that he was released from prison was in May 2025 after a sentence for contempt of court. But when he emerged from prison on that occasion, he came out saying that he'd become a Christian. And I think we've got a picture of him here upon his release from prison. There was a minister called Ricky Doolan, a guy who leads a church called Spirit Embassy in Tottenham, a former UKIP candidate who spoke of having been the pastor who led Robinson to Christ. Interestingly, after his release from prison, he was interviewed by a platform called Visegrad, which is another far-right media platform. And he spoke about his conversion and then said this. He said that he had looked deeply over the past few years about what we are fighting for and what made Britain, and it is Christianity. We are a Christian culture. This is where we've got to. And since his release, he's positioned himself as an advocate for Christian revival, and there have been quite notable displays of Christian symbolism at his rallies. And this is a picture from the Unite the Kingdom rally, and you can see the crosses and you can see the flags. 150,000 people there, and large crosses on display, and placards proclaiming Christ is King. So this is the sort of fusion that we're talking about. I'm going to take a break and discuss our thoughts on this. But before we do, I thought we would play a video. And there is a health warning. It's not a pleasant video to watch. But I'd like us just to take time to watch it and then talk about our reaction to it. And we're going to watch the opening prayer that was delivered at the Unite the Kingdom rally. And it was delivered by a Welsh preacher, a guy called Kai Dewar, who is a bishop in the Confessing Anglican Church. I don't know much about the Confessing Anglican Church, but I think they claim a certain sort of purity or faithfulness to creed that other churches may not, in their view, have. So it's about 5 minutes, this video. The syncing between the images and the what we can hear is just a little bit out, but you'll get the picture. So we'll watch this, and then if we want to get into groups, we can take 5-10 minutes to talk about how we feel about this. So thanks, Maggie.
And thank you.
And he, I think in Wales, is it the Hoyle, which is spoken about, the idea of the anointing, the gifting of a preacher. He reminds me of Ian Paisley, actually, coming from Northern Ireland. And I was talking to somebody before this. I know people who know of Ian Paisley from back in the 60s. And they would have said about Paisley, he could have taken ulcer for Christ. He was so powerful a preacher of the gospel in his young days. But it got corrupted, you know, and to me I almost found myself wondering about a God-given capacity which has been hijacked and been lost along the way. And I think that is very troubling, but needs to be named. So I just want to move on because we'll have another time of discussion in a moment. But I'm going to make 4 suggestions which we can talk about and add to or take away from, if we wish to, about maybe responses we might want to make to all of this. And I mean, the first thing I would want to say, and it's the most important thing, is I just think we need to be unequivocal in naming Christian nationalism as a distortion of truth. It's a heresy. And, you know, I don't think we can confront the arguments or being made by this movement with a kind of, well, on the one hand is this, and on the other hand is that. There are some moments when we're faced with a threat that is so grave that you just have to be clear and unambiguous. And the church has to say, not in our name. And when the church has to say, we are God's church, we are God's people, and we will be arbiters, thank you very much, of what is or isn't Christian truth. Tommy Robinson, you're not going to tell us what a Christian nation looks like. When you read the New Testament and you start with the Gospels, one of the things to bear in mind is nationalism is not a new thing. There were lots of Jews within Israel who were absolutely committed to overthrowing Roman rule. I spoke to somebody this afternoon, they put it very well. These were people who wanted to make Israel great again. And they wanted to take back control. It seems clear that Jesus never aligned himself with those movements. He talks at one point, doesn't he, about leaders of the Jewish people and some who followed them who wouldn't choose the things that make for peace. Remember, he wept over Jerusalem. And I think actually he is foreseeing the time of the sort of Maccabean rebellion in around AD 70. He knows that this violence is only going to lead to destruction and the loss of the temple. And there are certain gospel truths which I just don't think we can negotiate on. The idea that Christ died for all. And the church does not belong to one culture or ethnic group. There is no nation on earth which is more privileged in God's eyes. And Christiana, you mentioned it a moment ago, and it'll be up on the screen now. Those verses from Galatians 3, Paul says, "In Christ Jesus, you're all children of God through faith. For all of you were baptized into Christ. All of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus." And I don't think that's a one-off statement that Paul makes. I think all the time, the epistles he writes, he's basically saying, oh, look, here's a bunch of diverse people who've been called together and now need to live together in a way that expresses how Jesus breaks down boundaries. Ephesians 2, the dividing wall has been broken down and a new humanity has been created. A whole new category of people comprised of people who were near and people who were far. And I think you see a similar picture in Revelation. That idea of the destination to which God is calling us homeward. Revelation 7, 9 to 10. We read there, John looks and he says, "Before me there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language. And they all shout out, salvation belongs to our God." I think it's important maybe at this point just to say something briefly about the proliferation of Union Jacks or Union flags or whatever it is. Apparently it's only a Union Jack if it's on a boat. I don't know. Fun fact of the evening. I hope you take something more away than that. But this idea of flags on lampposts and in other public spaces. And I hear some people say, oh, we shouldn't have to apologise for flying our own flag and celebrating our own culture. But I just feel that when the flags are being put on a lamppost, they're not being put up to celebrate British culture. Feels to me that they're being used as boundary markers and as warning signs. And they're a way of saying, this space belongs to some people, but not to everyone. And as I've already said, I come from Northern Ireland. I have background on this sort of thing. And just one other point I want to make. I'm not saying that patriotism is wrong, and I'm not saying that national cultures are wrong. I think it's good to celebrate certain things about being British. I love our sense of irony. I love our sense of humour. I love our culture. I love some of the things that we've given the world, like lots of sports that people can outbeat us at. And I am a sucker for pomp and circumstance. And there are things that I love about other countries as well. I like going to France because I just love the Frenchness of it all, which I think is great. But I just have a problem with claiming that any one of these cultures is better than the other, or has some kind of God-given superiority or God-given status. We read near the end of Revelation, there's this statement about the New Jerusalem. And we're told that the nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. I think that's really interesting. I think amongst other things, John might want us to know that the New Jerusalem will be multicultural. And I sort of read that as maybe an idea that everything which is good about human culture now, it's not going to be burned off, it's not going to be got rid of or just jettisoned. The best of all human cultures will somehow be brought into the New Jerusalem and find their place there. So that's my first response, probably the longest, and I'll go through just 3 more before we have some discussion. As a Baptist, I would also want to insist on the separation of church and state, and I want to insist on the importance of religious freedom. A really important part of our identity as Baptists is that we are people who have known persecution. We have had forebears who struggled for the freedom to worship God as we saw fit, to gather to worship on our own terms, to be able to say, no, actually, we don't need someone to give us permission to gather and be a church, but if we want to gather and worship as we wish to, we can. There's a picture here on the screen of a guy called Thomas Helwys, who we may not have heard of, but he was one of the founders of the British Baptist movement. And he famously wrote, he went away, I mean, the British Baptists really went away to the Netherlands where they could be free to start up, and then some of them came back to the UK. And on his return to Britain, Thomas Helwys wrote a letter to James I, a handwritten letter, and he sent it to the king, arguing for religious freedom. And he said this: the king is a mortal man and not God, and therefore he hath no power over the mortal soul of his subjects to make laws and ordinances for them, and to set spiritual lords over them. You could say it was maybe a bit imprudent to actually send it to King James I. And for his trouble, he was thrown into Newgate jail and he died there. But when you read other writings of Helwys and the early Baptists, I find it very inspiring. They didn't just argue for freedom for themselves. They argued for freedom for Catholics to worship. They argued for freedom for Jews as well, to have religious liberty. And I think they were onto something important. They were radical. This was radical stuff for its time. We can't impose our faith on others. We may long for the church to be renewed. We may long for many more people to come to know God. I do. But that's to be called by his love and to know his forgiveness. And you can't do that through legislation. You just can't. And I do worry that as well, some of this talk of returning Britain to a time when it was more Christian, I just can't help feeling when it was more ordered and when it was more predictable and when it was more white, and it worked on certain terms for certain people. And that takes me on to my third point, which is just a reflection on what we're converting people from and what we're converting people to. And just a brief comment you might want to talk about in your groups about what is going on in our society at the minute and a number of different things that we see reported and how they might fit together. So one of the biggest talking points in the UK church over the last year has been this talk of a quiet revival and the fact that there are lots of young people, particularly young men, who are reading the Bible and who are going back to church. But of course there is also lots of data out there that tells us that young men are more likely to be right-wing. And that there seems to be a particular distinction again between young men and young women. Younger women seem to be more likely to vote for the Green Party, younger men to vote for Reform. And there was that data that I referred to earlier saying young men are likely to believe that feminism has gone too far and young women not. But it's also young men who are going out and buying the Bible. Is there an overlap between these groups? I wonder if there might be. I was talking before Christmas to one of my best friends. He's a Baptist minister, not leading a congregation at the minute, but worshipping in a church in Birmingham. And he told me about a young man who'd been attending church for a few months, and he walked into church off the street and said that he became a Christian through watching Charlie Kirk videos. Now, I discuss. And I found myself thinking, what do you do with that? And I thought back to what Paul says in Philippians 1, where he says, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, others out of goodwill, the latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the deference of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter, says Paul? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice. And I find it repugnant, really, that some people will claim to speak for Christ and will link their message to one of Christian nationalism and these politics. But it may be that God might use the words of some of these people to draw people to Christ. But if these people are coming to our churches, we've got an important task in our discipleship then, and that's where I get into this phrase, what are people being converted from, and what are they being converted to? And to me, it's important to stress, part of what it means to be a Christian, part of the fullness of what it is to be a follower of Jesus is that the gospel is a message of reconciliation. So if you've been called to Christ, you can't do it on your own. You need to do it in churches. And if you go to a church, you need to follow Jesus with people who aren't like you, which is basically the New Testament in a nutshell, or at least Paul's letters. Dear people who now find themselves worshipping with people who aren't like you, what are you going to do now that Christ has called you together? And then there's just one final response, which I want to talk about and ask us to think about. And I offer this to you. I think there is something as well that we need to have as part of our response, which is about listening to people who are marginalized without looking down on them and without exploiting their fears. And it's one of the things I think we do need to recognize. There are lots of people in our country who feel left behind, and they feel that they've lost out as a consequence of globalization. They certainly feel forgotten by politicians in London. Most of us here will know that before I came to Selsdon, I spent 8 years in a church in Birmingham, and it was located in what you could describe as an old white working class estate. And it had been impacted terribly, the area, by deindustrialisation. There'd been the closure of MG Rover, which used to be British Leyland. There have been other factories. Every funeral I did, I'm not exaggerating, every funeral I did in those 8 years, the person who died had a connection with either MG Rover or another part of the car industry or Cadbury's. Because that's what you did in South Birmingham for decades. You either worked for Cadbury's or you worked in the car industry. And it's practically all gone. And like I say, that idea, again, it was austerity was happening as well. I think particularly if you haven't ever lived outside of London, you might have no idea of how people who are outside of London feel really cut off and really feel as if the rest of the country doesn't give a monkeys about them, or particularly people in London don't give a monkeys. So it's a complex picture. There was a feeling among many people that they'd been forgotten. There was a feeling that many other groups were getting preferential treatment. And there was a dependency culture I sometimes felt among those white families that was different to the more aspirational culture of other groups. I think there were issues around community organizing. I think Afro-Caribbean people in Handsworth were miles better at community organisation, and Muslims in Sparkbrook and Sparkhill were miles better at community organisation than people were in our states. They were miles ahead. But it doesn't take away from a sense of loss that they had, and loss of jobs and loss of opportunity, and sometimes a feeling that everyone else's culture is being celebrated but ours isn't because we've been left behind. Now, in fairness to them, at that time, they weren't sticking up Union Jacks on every lamppost and telling people to stay out. They managed to work through their sense of loss without any of that happening. But I think we need to listen to people who find themselves in that place with respect and empathy. Because if we don't listen, someone else will. And where there are grievances that people feel, there are always people willing to exploit grievances and sense of loss. And, we need to be honest about where the church fits into that in the UK. The church in the UK is largely middle class. It is. It's a very middle class organisation. And if we're not careful, we could come across as just one more group of people who talk down to people and tell them, oh, you shouldn't really think that. That's not right. So we need to have an answer to people which is more than just, you mustn't fly those flags. Do you see what I mean? Just a final thought before we go into discussion. When I was preparing for this evening, I came across some words which we might find controversial, but I'm going to put them on the table. And they're from an article last year in The Guardian, which looked at the backlash against policies and attitudes which are often characterised as woke. And as part of the article, Gabby Hinsliff, who is an excellent social commentator, I think really, really good, and political commentator, she interviews a guy called Luke Trill, who is a progressive. He worked for years for Stonewall, and he'd recently reported, or written a report, on progressive activists in the UK, and why progressives sometimes struggle to take people with them. And as I read these words, which quote what Luke Trill is thinking, bear in mind that this is, I think, a gay progressive who has come to this conclusion about what went wrong. So the article says, core to woke philosophy is what is sometimes called systemic thinking, or the idea that society consists of overlapping systems of oppression, from capitalism to patriarchy, which we are socialized not to notice, and to which we must be awoken by unpacking the power dynamics hidden in everyday interactions between men and women, say, or people of different races. And pointing out undercurrents others have missed is therefore very important to progressives. They genuinely think it's helpful, Trill says. But not everyone shares their enthusiasm for what quickly descended in the gladiatorial arena of late 2010s Twitter into pile-ons and point scoring. So there's a group of people who come from a position of, I have some questions about this, but everyone shouts at them, and they become radicalized the other way. I think he's on to something there. And I hear a lot of people who say, well, I have a lot of sympathy for progressive ideas, but I don't want it imposed on me. I don't want people always telling me what to think. And I just think there's something important being named here, that progressive people can often be very patronizing. And if people feel as if they're constantly being talked down to, they'll be driven to people who come from the opposite direction. And how do we make sure we don't do that? Again, I come back to Jesus. Jesus was amazing. I mean, Jesus is fantastic. And he called out injustice. And he summoned people to change. And he told them to repent because the kingdom of God was at hand. Get your act together, a new world is coming. Sort yourself out and live like this. But he didn't seem to patronize people, and he seemed to do it in a very winsome and attractive way. And how do we come alongside people in that way and so kind of acknowledge loss, but say, come on, come with us. I realize there's an awful lot there. And sorry again that we started later because of the issues with the AV, but just thought we'd maybe take a little bit of time if we wanted to take, say, 7 or 8 minutes in our groups. Just talk about do we agree or disagree with these responses? Please disagree, because if everyone just says, oh, that was okay, just to move us on. Is there anything we'd add to the list? Or is there anything we'd take away from it? So if we do that, and then we can sort of come back in the round and maybe have a little bit of feedback and maybe some thoughts about what we might do ourselves as churches in Selsdon. If anyone has any ideas, that'd be good.